India plans to close a $189 billion import gap with two levers: AI automation and PLI subsidies. One of those levers is quietly eroding the other's foundation. From $860 million to nearly $5 billion by 2030. India's AI manufacturing market is compounding at 41.5% a year. The catch-up isn't coming, it's already here. AI in manufacturing means fewer workers, higher capital intensity, thinner employment multipliers. So what happens to the millions on MSME payrolls with no safety net at all? China dependence, sanctions pressure, a Strait of Hormuz choke point make this pivot a necessity. But if capital depth beats the agility and jobs MSMEs provide, is this the license Raj, wearing an AI badge? Let's break down exactly how India's import substitution strategy and its AI manufacturing push are pulling against each other, and what that means for the 110 million workers caught between them. India's manufacturing plan needs cheap labor, but is eliminating it. What happens to India's 110 million plus MSME workforce if large firms capture AI productivity gains while no social safety net architecture exists in the current policy framework? Let's set the stage. India just moved to cut its dependence on foreign goods in a serious, structural way. In the fiscal year ending March 2026, India imported $775 billion worth of goods, a number large enough to fund several national budgets. Nearly 20% of that, roughly $155 billion, came from China alone. That is a significant concentration of supply chain exposure sitting in a single geopolitical relationship. India's response was to draw a line. The government identified $189 billion worth of imports that domestic industry could, in principle, replace. A structured list of things India decided it should be making for itself. Within that, $51 billion covers roughly 100 critical input items flagged for immediate intervention. Raw materials and components where supply chain vulnerability is most acute. And then, on July 15, 2026, the cabinet approved the next accelerant, 1.9 lakh crore rupees, $19.7 billion, added to the production-linked incentive scheme, specifically targeting semiconductor chips and smartphone component ecosystems end-to-end. Now here is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Among large Indian manufacturers, AI adoption jumped from 45% in 2022 to 65% in 2024. A 20 percentage point shift in just 2 years. That pace matters enormously when you consider who sits below those large manufacturers. India's MSME sector. Over 110 million workers across micro, small, and medium enterprises. Supplies, components, handles logistics, and absorbs the labor that anchor firms do not retain. These are not peripheral workers. They are the connective tissue of the entire industrial chain. When large firms automate rapidly, two things happen to MSMEs simultaneously. Demand for their labor-intensive subcomponents can shrink as anchor firms bring more production in-house through automated lines. And the technology gap between large and small firms widens, making it progressively harder for MSMEs to qualify as suppliers at all. Without targeted credit, skilling pipelines, or a formal social safety architecture, that gap does not self-correct. So the core tension is this. India's import substitution plan rests on cost-competitive domestic production. That competitiveness has historically come from lower labor costs. But the government's own AI and automation mandate, designed to lift quality and scale, is systematically eroding that very cost base. There is no explicit reconciliation of this tension anywhere in the current policy framework. India built something ambitious here. The question is whether the two engines of that ambition are quietly working against each other. And that changes everything about how this industrial reboot actually plays out. India's robot density, 30 per 10,000 workers. Global average, 132. What does a 30 to 132 robot density gap mean for India's ability to compete on quality rather than cost alone in precision pharma and advanced electronics exports? That question has a structural answer, and it isn't the one most coverage lands on. The instinct is to read a low robot density figure as a development lag, a catch-up problem, something to solve slowly. But the data running underneath that headline number tells a different story entirely. India sits at 30 industrial robots per 10,000 workers. The global average is 132. South Korea runs at 1,220, a benchmark that reflects decades of coordinated industrial policy layered onto an export-first manufacturing base. China is at 166, per the International Federation of Robotics, and Beijing is still accelerating deployment. That comparative gap is the structural pressure point, and the market forming in response to it is moving at a pace that compresses the timeline considerably. India's AI in manufacturing market stands at $860 million in 2025. By 2030, that reaches $4.89 billion. That's a 41.5% compound annual growth rate. One of the fastest industrial AI expansion curves anywhere globally, and it's being driven by a specific structural dynamic. A low robot density base doesn't delay the transition, it concentrates it. Large cap manufacturers in automotive, pharma, and electronics carry the balance sheet capacity to deploy AI and robotics at scale right now. The firms that cannot follow, the MSME tier, get left on the cost labor side of the ledger with no visible policy bridge. The PLI ecosystem is where this concentration becomes concrete. Surma SGS and the semiconductor PLI cohort are receiving direct capital allocation for end-to-end component manufacturing. Not final assembly, not finishing work, but integrated precision production. That is a qualitatively different kind of industrial infrastructure, and it changes what those facilities can credibly supply to regulated export markets. The software layer being written on top of that PLI subsidized hardware base by IBM, Siemens, Wipro, TCS, and Dassault Systems is building the quality management and process control architecture that pharma and electronics regulators in the US and EU actually require before they approve suppliers. For large caps already deploying, AI-driven systems are delivering 30 to 50% reductions in unplanned downtime, translating directly into the consistency and traceability those export regulators demand. What India has constructed, quietly and through compounding policy decisions, is a productivity infrastructure that sets the quality floor for the next decade of export ambition. That changes the competitive position India can now hold, not just on price, but on precision. 3 different import substitution numbers. No one knows which is real. Is India's import substitution strategy suffering from strategic ambiguity at the highest levels, or does the 3-tier figure structure reflect deliberate phased implementation? That question sits at the heart of everything that follows, and the answer is more uncomfortable than either side of it suggests. To understand why 3 numbers coexist, you need the pre-1991 baseline. India ran a near-total import substitution regime for 4 decades after independence. The result was a domestic manufacturing sector shielded from competition, but also insulated from efficiency pressure. Capital goods produced at 2 to 3 times global cost, electronics assembled from components that themselves required protected inputs. When liberalization arrived in 1991, much of that industrial base couldn't survive exposure to world prices. That history is not decorative context. It is the live constraint every policymaker in Delhi is working against today. So when the current architecture produces 3 figures rather than 1, that isn't confusion. It is the direct institutional memory of what happens when ambition outruns execution. Here is how the tiers actually break down on the whiteboard. Internal government analysis identifies $398 billion of India's import base as theoretically substitutable, meaning domestic production could, under ideal conditions, replace it. This ceiling number includes everything from specialty chemicals and machine tools to consumer electronics and pharmaceutical intermediates. But active plans, per business standard reporting, target only $189 billion. That reduction isn't timidity. It is the government acknowledging that roughly half the theoretical ceiling hits practical walls immediately. Missing supplier ecosystems, absent testing infrastructure, or component complexity that requires years of capability building before domestic alternatives are viable. Within that $189 billion, a $51 billion critical input subset is flagged for intervention right now. This tier concentrates on sectors where supply disruption would cause cascading failures across the manufacturing value chain. Active pharmaceutical ingredients, advanced semiconductors, and precision defense components sit here. The geopolitical dimension sharpens this further. Approximately $155 billion of India's import base traces directly back to China, representing a concentration risk that no diversification program can absorb quickly. And roughly 100 specific line items sit at the sharpest end of that exposure. The products where substitution failure would be felt fastest and most visibly. Here is the cost inflation mechanism the 3 tiers are designed to manage. Every time you mandate domestic sourcing ahead of domestic capability, input costs rise for downstream manufacturers. That cost inflation erodes export competitiveness. The very outcome this program is meant to build. The $398 billion figure represents maximum ambition. The $189 billion reflects what is practicable. The $51 billion reflects what India can execute immediately without triggering the cost spiral that would undermine the strategy entirely. And encoding that logic into the architecture is, quietly, the most significant policy decision in this whole program. 110 million workers face displacement. No safety net exists. What happens to India's 110 million plus MSME workforce if large firms capture AI productivity gains while no social safety net architecture exists in the current policy framework? That question is not rhetorical. It is the structural gap that every other number in this analysis points toward. Earlier in this breakdown, we landed on a clause worth repeating. Only for firms with capital to deploy. That phrase tells you exactly who gets left out. And it tells you why the workforce exposure figure is not an abstraction. India's MSME sector employs more than 110 million people. The sectors most targeted by import substitution, textiles, footwear, electronics assembly, are precisely the sectors where automation makes the clearest economic case. Capital goes where returns are highest. Labor absorbs the residual risk. AI adoption in Indian manufacturing is compounding at 41.5% annually. That is not a forecast. That is the current trajectory, and it is accelerating faster than any reskilling program on the books has been designed to absorb. India starts from a robot density of just 30 per 10,000 workers. That low baseline does not signal safety. It signals that the displacement curve is still at its steepest early gradient. The catch-up is coming fast, and it is coming for the assembly line first. Here is the argument no one in the policy room wants to make explicit. Import substitution creates domestic production demand, but the AI upgrade eliminates the jobs that production would have generated. Those two forces are not complementary. They are competing for the same workforce. When automation cuts factory downtime by 30 to 50%, the annualized cost per unit case for replacing a human worker becomes straightforward arithmetic for any CFO running a capital-intensive floor. Efficiency wins. Labor loses the ledger entry. We have established that roughly $155 billion in Chinese intermediate goods flow into India annually. The active substitution plan targets $189 billion of that supply chain. The ambition is sovereign. The arithmetic, however, cuts both ways. Because the workers who would assemble those components domestically face the same displacement pressure from automation that Chinese exporters face from substitution itself. The policy wins on supply chain security. It has not yet won on labor protection. Reskilling pathways appear in policy documents as aspiration. They do not yet appear as funded programs with defined timelines, measurable cohort targets, or sector-specific curricula matched to the exact job categories automation is eliminating. Aspiration without appropriation is not a safety net. It is a press release. The trend line on AI adoption keeps rising. The workforce exposure number stays fixed at 110 million. Until those two curves have a funded, mandatory reconciliation mechanism between them, the most important variable in this entire transformation remains completely unaccounted for. And that changes everything India still needs to solve. 1991 liberalization fixed import substitution mistakes. Now we are repeating them. Is India's current import substitution strategy repeating the license Raj's durable inefficiency mistakes? Or does the AI automation layer change the historical outcome? That three-figure ambiguity. $398 billion theoretical, $189 billion active, $51 billion critical. Doesn't just signal strategic confusion. It echoes something India has lived through before, and the stakes of getting the answer wrong are generational. Here is what most coverage misses. The license Raj didn't fail because India lacked ambition. It failed because the government controlled what got made, what it cost, and who received it. That architecture rewarded political connections over productive efficiency. Industrialists competed for licenses, not customers. Output was rationed, not earned. The result was protected domestic monopolies that never had to earn their survival in a competitive market. And when 1991 arrived, India didn't just liberalize. It spent the following decade dismantling 4 decades of embedded inefficiency that import substitution, implemented without competitive discipline, had quietly calcified into the industrial structure itself. The geopolitical pressure driving today's policy is real and legitimate. US sanctions exposure, the Strait of Hormuz choke point vulnerability, the $155 billion China import dependency. These are strategic threats demanding a response. The urgency is not manufactured, but urgency is precisely the condition under which historical mistakes get repeated fastest, because speed compresses the deliberation that design requires. When a government cannot agree on a single authoritative number, when 3 different figures coexist without resolution across $398 billion, $189 billion, and $51 billion, it signals that execution is racing ahead of design. That is the speed versus deliberation trade-off. Move fast enough to answer the geopolitical threat, move too fast and you build insulation without competitiveness. 1991 didn't happen because India lacked manufacturing capacity. It happened because that capacity, built behind protective walls, couldn't compete once the walls came down. Protected production is not the same as productive production, and that lesson cost a generation to learn. Now here is where the labor versus automation contradiction sharpens the warning. India's manufacturing sovereignty push assumes labor-intensive scale. Millions of jobs, deep domestic consumption linkages, wage-driven demand growth. But the AI automation layer, the 41.5% CAGR in manufacturing intelligence, and the quality precision advantages all push in the opposite direction. Fewer workers, higher capital intensity, thinner employment multipliers. If both objectives remain simultaneously stated without resolution, India risks building a manufacturing base that is too automated to deliver the employment dividend and too labor-dependent to achieve the efficiency frontier. That internal contradiction is structurally identical to the license Raj's defining failure. A policy architecture that tried to achieve competing goals simultaneously and achieved neither fully. The historical parallel isn't perfect, but the structural warning stands. If the labor versus automation contradiction stays unresolved, what India risks building is a manufacturing base insulated from external shocks but inefficient from within. And that changes everything about what this sovereignty push can ultimately deliver. Imagine two engines bolted to the same aircraft, pulling in opposite directions. That is what India's dual-track manufacturing strategy actually is. The license Raj warning, the three unresolved figures: 398 billion, 189 billion, 51 billion. They all point at the same uncomfortable question. Has India actually chosen what kind of manufacturing power it wants to be? Or is it trying to be both at once without saying so? I think the real story here is this. The contradiction was never hidden. It was built in. Import substitution only works if domestic production is cheaper than the import it replaces. And that has historically meant labor cost as the margin. But the automation drive we trace through the factories is doing exactly the opposite. It is systematically eliminating the labor advantage that makes substitution viable in the first place. At a 41.5% annual growth rate in AI adoption, this is not a gradual adjustment. It is a structural replacement happening faster than any policy response could track. India starts from 30 robots per 10,000 workers, near the bottom of any comparable economy, which means the displacement shock, when it arrives at scale, will not be buffered by an already automated baseline. That exposure lands on more than 110 million MSME workers with no visible social safety net architecture to absorb it. And the three import substitution numbers that no one has reconciled publicly: 398 billion, 189 billion, 51 billion, are not a measurement problem. They are a symptom of a political choice that has not been made. The pre-1991 inefficiency risk persists precisely because protecting domestic production from external competition without resolving who bears the internal cost is how you build a manufacturing base that survives geopolitical shocks but cannot compete on its own terms. Here is what no one wants to say. The geopolitical urgency, the China dependence, the Strait of Hormuz exposure, the sanctions pressure, makes this tension more acute, not less. Urgency is the enemy of strategic clarity. The reveal, though, is almost clarifying. This is not a policy failure. It is an unresolved strategic choice presented as if it were already resolved. India can slow AI deployment to preserve labor competitiveness and accept the quality ceiling that comes with it. Or India can accelerate automation, accept MSME displacement, and build the social architecture to manage that transition honestly. What India proved it can do, sustaining a manufacturing ambition this large, this fast, under this much geopolitical pressure, is genuinely hard. But attempting both tracks simultaneously, without choosing, is how the license Raj was born the first time. The resolution is not technical, it is political. And until that choice is made explicit, every number in this story stays contested. And 110 million workers stay exposed to a transition nobody has officially planned for. Making that choice openly, whatever it is, would be the hardest and most consequential thing Indian industrial policy has done since 1991. Follow us for more updates like this. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and X.